Hello, Bridgetown Church, and all of you who follow our teachings on the podcast. This is John Mark Comer, and this is a very special announcement. We wanted to let you know that as of today, we are launching a brand new podcast called This Cultural Moment. It's a collaboration between Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, and our friends at Red Church in Melbourne, Australia, as well as between myself and Mark Sayers. You may or may not know Mark Sayers. I would argue he's one of the most important living teachers in the world right now. He is a pastor and teacher, but really he's best known for cultural commentary, and his writings and his way of reading the post-Christian, secular, progressive, urbanized, digital moment that we're in has been over-the-top helpful in my own life as well as at our church. Portland, Oregon was called by Outreach Magazine the post-Christian frontier. We're kind of the vanguard of a new emerging society, and you're seeing it more not only in Portland, but in cities across America, if you're in LA or New York, and more in Atlanta or even places through the Midwest and all around, of course, Western Europe. You're seeing this new emerging society that is post-Christian. And so the question we're all asking is, all right, how do we follow Jesus in this kind of a moment where the soil is a bit corrosive to faith? And how do we do church in a way that is healthy and thriving and people are coming to faith, and those of us who believe in Jesus are being with him and becoming like him and doing all of his kingdom stuff in our place? And so basically this podcast is less me and Mark Sayers, and it's more just interview style. My goal is to draw out the muse that is Mark Sayers' brain and his heart and to interpret it into English for, those of us that are a bit closer to the middle of the bell curve. So we hope you like it. We're going to post the first episode on our feed, and then if you like it, go follow it on iTunes or Podbean or whatever your podcast platform is. And it would be a huge help if you could write a review online or post something on social media, or just tell your friends and family, get the word out. And it's not a weekly thing. We plan to release, seasons. So this is winter season, and hopefully spring is next. There are 5 episodes in this first one, 5 20-minute episodes on one question: what is post-Christian culture? So we hope you enjoy it. Here's myself and Mark Sayers with the first ever episode of This Cultural Moment. Hey everybody, welcome to This Cultural Moment, a podcast where we talk about following Jesus in the secular, progressive, post-Christian world. I'm John Mark Comer. I live in Portland, Oregon, where I teach the way of Jesus at Bridgetown Church, and I am here with the legendary Mark Sayers, who is also a pastor and teacher at Red Church in Melbourne, Australia. But what Mark is really known for is cultural commentary. So the end goal of this podcast is for myself to sit here and channel the muse that is all things Mark Sayers as we talk about how do we follow Jesus in this kind of a cultural moment. In this, our first podcast, we ask the question, what is post-Christian culture?
Post-Christianity is the Christian project attempted to be continued, forgetting its sources that it comes from. So in a sense, it's the kingdom without the king.
Mark, good morning. You're here. You just got into Portland from Melbourne along with your team. So we're sitting here in this dingy basement of an old church that we rent out on Sunday nights. And you're getting over jet lag. We have our heart coffee here to keep you awake. Yes. Me awake. I think you've had 3 cups already.
I've had 3. I'm good.
It's great to have you here. So good to be with you. Hey, I live in Portland, as you know. You live in Melbourne. I was just in your city. Now you're in mine, and they're very similar. You sound a lot cooler, but we pronounce English better.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Pros and cons. And I hear this catchphrase a lot about post-Christian culture. And you hear it used in relation to a city like a Portland or a Melbourne or a San Francisco or LA or New York or Austin or London. And more of the Western world as a whole. As the world is getting larger, it's also getting smaller through the rise of the internet and the digital age and globalism. And so more and more, we're all breathing the air of this kind of Western, secular, post-Christian cultural moment, whether you live in the urban core of a Portland or a Melbourne like you and I, or in suburban Atlanta, more and more we're all breathing this kind of an air. So what exactly do we mean by post-Christian culture? And if there's a post-Christian culture, does that mean there's such a thing as Christian culture or pre-Christian culture? What is the paradigm that you're working out of?
I mean, the term post-Christian's been around for some time. So even Australia in the 18th century was described as a post-Christian culture. So there's that sense that if you look at Western history and the trajectory of so much Western thought, and things like the Enlightenment and so on, people have been using the term for a little while. I think probably in the last sort of 20 years in Christian circles, there was a realization that we'd moved beyond, I guess, the era of Christendom and we're dealing with a new context.
And that happened sooner in Australia than in America.
Yes.
I mean, you're saying 18th century. That's a very long time ago. People were talking about post-Christian culture.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Australia was begun, America was begun as a utopia. Australia begins as a dystopia.
Right.
You begin with religious sort of refugees from Europe. We begin with convicts.
Yeah, we get off the boat and have a prayer meeting.
Yes.
And you get off the boat and have an orgy, right?
Yes.
That's how the story goes.
Yes, pretty much. So my great-great-great-great-grandmother or whatever, comes off and was put into this particular kind of prison in a place called Port Arthur in Tasmania, and that prison was designed with the thought of an English philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, who was trying to create this sort of modernist prison, which everyone would be reformed, through the means of the Enlightenment into this new kind of human, which didn't work that well. It was actually pretty horrible. So the term's been around for some time, but I think, Christian circles, it's increasingly used in cities like yours and mine. It's increasingly used to describe the context of the West. And I think there's some confusion around how we use it. So there's almost a sense that it's been used and understood as a culture that's, again, in a sense, rejected Christianity, that's like moved beyond it and has no vestiges left of Christianity today. Similar with Christendom, people talk about, post-Christendom culture. But I think what people miss is that I think it's still there. I often say it's like Hamlet's ghost. He's dead, but he's still influencing the plot of the play.
Yeah, it's the Julian Barnes line, I don't believe in God, but I miss him.
Yes.
That sense of how the West is haunted by its Christian past.
Yes, absolutely.
So is there a paradigm for Christian culture or pre-Christian culture?
Yeah, I mean, like a sort of simple paradigm that I've used, which sort of is borrowing a concept from the sociologist Philip Reif, is this idea of first, second, and third culture. So there's the sense that you have that pre-Christian culture where the world is deeply shaped by spiritual forces. The average person feels themselves in a world besieged. This is where, a world of taboos, a world of multiple gods, a world of superstition where, everything has, a sense of foreboding behind it.
So it's the Roman Empire before the gospel of Jesus and what was called paganism. It's the barbarians up in the north, ancient European, neo-pagan, Wiccan kind of, that's a pre-Christian culture. Highly spiritual, but no knowledge of Christ.
Yes, and you see that sort of across the world before Christianity comes. And then you have what Reif would call a second culture, which is, a creedal culture. It's a culture, we classically look at something like, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. It's a culture which has a monotheistic view of God. It's rejected the ancient sort of paganism. It's moved into this more monotheistic, more, justice-based sense of faith and often has, sacred book that it works out of.
Right. So does Reif's philosophy of first culture, second culture, third culture only apply to Christianity or to religion, or does it apply, is there a pre-democratic culture, post-democratic culture? Is there a pre-secular, secular, post-secular cultural moment, or is it just applied to Christ?
Well, he was a sort of well-known sociologist who then, wrote a lot about the history of psychology and, really was, I guess, had this project. His background was Jewish and he became more overtly Jewish as he got older. And so he was trying to display to people the religious sort of underpinnings of so much of our sort of progression philosophically, that people thought that they'd got rid of religion, but it was still operating. And he talked about how therapy was, still religious in that sense. So he talks about then after comes a third culture, and a third culture defines itself against the second culture. So he very much saw that there was this rebellion against creedal culture, and he was trying to advocate for elements of Judaism, and he had an appreciation for Christianity as well, despite being a Jewish. And he then talked about that third culture is defining itself against second culture. And I think that's the part that so many people have missed about understanding post-Christian culture.
So it doesn't just mean that, hey, we've moved on.
Yes.
The West used to have a Christian or a Christianized, it was never Christian, but a Christianized culture. Christian technically is not an adjective, it's a noun, but we use it often as an adjective. But post-Christian culture doesn't just mean we've moved on. It's a reaction against.
Yes. And it's almost an anti or anti, as you would say, culture. So it's defining itself against, and it's actually deconstructing. So much of the sort of post-Enlightenment, some people would use the term postmodern, is that sense of deconstructing what has come before. So it's deconstructing and wanting to run on with the project of Christianity, but without Christ.
Okay, so talk to us about that, because I feel like we're living in this cultural moment of deconstruction. You see it in the church, in particular with my generation. I'm born in '80, so I'm the first year for the millennial thing. And and your generation is too. I mean, you're Gen X, you're a few years older than me, but so much deconstruction at not only a theological level, now we see it at a political level, at a socioeconomic level, at a racial level. There's just deconstruction, and some of it I think is actually really healthy, but it just feels like we're tearing the world down one brick at a time.
Well, Leslie Newbigin, who's a missiologist, he talked about the fact that, in a sense, if you look at, say, Galatians, it talks about, moving beyond the elementary principles in the world, that with Christ's coming, that this desacralizing of the world had occurred. So no one could go back to paganism as it was understood before. And so there's this real religious change that happens after Christ. And so in a sense, the whole world could be described as post-Christian. Islam is something which defines itself against Christianity. Even contemporary Buddhism, as we understand it, was, in a sense, goes through this process of defining itself against Christianity as well. You have a Buddhist flag it's created. There was a guy, I think his name was Olcott, who was a Presbyterian, sort of liberal Presbyterian, who then sort of becomes a Buddhist and shapes a lot of understanding about how Buddhism exists. So many sort of world religions then redefine themselves in dialogue with sort of the Christian mission movement.
Because it's spread all over the world. It
Exactly.
has a global historic influence.
Yes. And alongside modernity, which also spreads around the world, and economic, development and the industrialization of the world. So there's this sense then that Christianity is something which Newbigin says almost partners a little bit with secularization, in the sense that after Christianity is even taken to a place like India, which is where he was a missionary in India, it then sort of says to men, here's Christianity, but then here's economics alongside it, industrialization and so on. You can't then go back to this pagan understanding of the world where you're in fear of gods. So it creates this sort of secularism, which in a sense Christianity can hold together at some point. But then as we begin to move beyond Christianity, you then have this Christian tone or Christian temper to global culture, but it doesn't have the sort of bulwarks holding back the human sort of Promethean spirit.
So in your book, Disappearing Church, which of all of your books is by far my favorite, you have this little line, how we want the kingdom without the king. And that's
Yes.
kind of your one-line summary of post-Christian culture, how we want so many of the aspects of what Jesus called the kingdom of God, which was a social vision. And it was a socio-political vision even. Now we hear political and think Democratic or Republican or, but that's not what he's getting at. But it was a socio-political vision. It had to do with the polis, with society, with how we organize as human beings. And so many of the values of the kingdom of God, justice and peace and equality, are really the core of so much of post-Christian culture on the left and on the right all over the Western world. But yet there's this reaction now to the idea of Christ as king.
Yes. So, I mean, and I think some of us in the West don't realize how cultural that is. So even equality. So, for example, a place like India, where you've had a karmic view of the world, where we would look at someone who's, say, homeless, and we feel the outrage around that and so on. If you believe in a karmic world of multiple lives and someone is homeless, they're incurring, in a sense, the punishment, for want of a better term, of something that happened in previous life. So in that view of the world, in Eastern views of the world, which is very cyclical, you don't have this idea that we're going to progress to this utopian future. You don't have this idea that everyone
Social justice.
There's
no moral imperative for social justice.
Exactly. So, whilst you have those things in places like India now, we don't realize how much that has grown out of the Christian vision. Post-Christianity is the Christian project attempted to be continued, even forgetting its sources that it comes from. So in a sense, it's the kingdom without the king. It's that project of secularization, which, in a sense, accompanied, where people were freed from, the pagan powers controlling everything, from that fear of the universe. But then you have some of these sort of restraints disappearing. So one example would be around how much the West has fallen into a form of self-hatred. Now, there's an element of that which is actually from the Christian vision. The interesting thing is that the church...
is that like the prophetic instinct that the church
Yes.
has to criticize itself,
Yes.
that goes all the way back to the Hebrew prophets, to like
Totally.
celebrate who we are, but yet critique who we aren't?
I mean, you just think of the book of Ezekiel. There's this incredible passage, I think it's Ezekiel 8, where, Ezekiel is shown the temple priesthood secretly in this back room worshipping idols. And, it's almost like a David Lynch movie. There's these insects crawling around, and then the Shekinah glory actually leaves the temple. And at the beginning of Ezekiel, it's actually found in Babylon. So there's this
And this is insider critique. So this isn't some
Totally.
angry post-Christian blogger. This is a prophet, a Hebrew prophet, who is
Totally.
like critiquing the temple, the epicenter of his nation and his
Yes.
faith.
And you see, all the stuff in the Old Testament prophetic tradition in the church. I mean, the book of Acts doesn't give us this squeaky clean version of the church. Ananias and Sapphira stealing money, calling
the New Testament letters, Paul to the
exactly,
Corinthians. Yeah.
Wolves coming amongst you and so on. So that then continues in the Western tradition, that insider critique, where there's an element, we'll critique ourselves harder than we'll critique other people. So like Donald Trump will tweet something angry at, the North Korean regime, who are horrible, who have gulags so big you can see them from space, who have, I think it's abducted 160,000 people from other nations. Like this is Nazi Germany bad, but we'll critique the President of the United States for a bad tweet more than we'll name the incredible injustice, racism, violence of the North Korean regime. So there's this sense where we always point at ourselves. So there's an element of the progressive vision which wants to critique the West. And so there's an element of that which is prophetic, but without Christ, it becomes self-hating.
Yes. Because instead of under his authority, it's a rebellion against his authority. I mean, one of the questions I have, the Western democratic vision, I've been reading some of the founding fathers recently, was based on a Judeo-Christian moral ethic. John Adams, who wasn't a follower of Jesus, who's a Unitarian, just read his biography, was emphatic that this system only works with a unified moral ethic. That was essentially the Judeo-Christian, not theology, but moral ethic. And so one of the things I think that's so interesting is now the West has this moral and socio-political vision for society that is a hangover from the teachings of Jesus and what he called the kingdom of God. But we no longer have an authority. We no longer have Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the writings of the New Testament as our authority. So now we argue for justice and equality and freedom, which of course would be defined, but without the same sense of authority. And I feel like we're floundering more than ever as our moral visions for America, for the West, diverge.
Yes. And then what happens in that place is that there's almost a hint here, I think, of Genesis and the fall, in the sense that Adam and Eve are presented with the serpent's question that if they, eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they can become like gods. So in a sense, that's a divine project to become like gods, but they want to do it with their own authority intact. They want to,
So let's end this episode with this. Before we came here, we were at Heart Coffee down the street. We're in the west end of downtown Portland. We're having, batch brew coffee, as you would call it in Australia, that cost $4 or something like that. We're in beautiful architecture, Scandinavian style design. You had breakfast across the street this morning. There's a $4 brioche donut if you want it for a snack. And we're in utopia. We're living in the progressive vision, in what you call the beautiful world. And I love how you chat about, 20 years ago, so Blade Runner's coming out soon, one of the movies a lot of us are really excited about this fall, the kind of follow-up with Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford still in it, to the original, which was, 80? What year was the original?
82, I think.
82, yeah. So I was a baby at the time. And you make the point, that was kind of how people thought the future would turn out a few decades ago, was this kind of dystopian LA and the rain and global warming, so everything's a disaster. And instead, we're sitting here with $4 coffee and we're wearing nice clothes and we had a good breakfast and we cycle everywhere and there's parks and architecture. So is post-Christian culture delivering on its promise?
I think it was Douglas Copeland said a number of years ago, the future is going to be this German city of Bonn, which is like this very pleasant, quiet, modern city. And in a sense, that's what's arrived. But there's an element in that where that's that vision which post-Christianity promises, there's still an injustice at the heart of it. there's still gentrification. There is still a Portland is able to be a Portland because, there's a border around the country.
Because there's a Vietnam to make our shoes.
Exactly.
Because there's a middle of America to drive our trucks and,
Exactly. And so there's the element where the secularization project still requires this space of protection for the individual then to pursue their free will. So everything around us is a form of theology in the post-Christian society. All the stuff you mentioned before is a form of forming and a theology. But also what I think it's not delivering is, it's not, because you said that central sort of defining vision of the West, that foundation isn't there, it's giving us nice coffee, but it's not giving us a sense of meaning.
Right, so you have two problems. One is this beautiful world that you and I live in is a tiny little percentage of the world that enjoy $4 coffee and live in this beautiful city and don't fear crime or violence, where it's Elysium, if you saw that movie or know the Greek myth. And the cracks are starting to show that the world that we enjoy is basically the byproduct of human trafficking, massive socioeconomic injustice, globalism, so on and so forth. But then at the same side, even in the beautiful world, the people there sitting on their $2,000 MacBook, drinking their $4 coffee, wearing their raw denim as they work for whatever cool ad agency in town, are racked by anxiety.
Yes.
The family is basically a disaster across our nation. In the church I lead, 64% of us come from a broken home. You have mental illness that is just skyrocketing all across America. You have relational breakdown. You have now the socio-political breakdown, our nation's hostility, outrage, anger. We no longer have a way to turn out character. We no longer have a vision for character or any kind of formation machine in secular culture to make men and women of character. You have racial injustice that's now come to the surface and is tearing the fabric of our society apart. So post-Christian culture, it has good coffee and great design, but we're missing a few things.
Absolutely.
Great stuff. So much more to talk about, and we hope you tune in again. We are a brand new podcast, so if you want to help us out, spread the word, share a link with your family or friends to this online, or if you could do us a huge favor, just go to iTunes really fast and write a review. Hopefully a good one, but that's up to you. Write a quick 1-2 sentence review, spread the word, and we'll be back soon with episode 2.